Now, for his perspective, Mr. Doctor, I should say, Ron Paul of the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Dr. Paul, great to see you. What do you think of these tariffs?
Oh, David, I know you know what I think. A tariff is a tax, and I don't like taxes. It's a bunch of economic planning, and I don't like economic planning. And I don't know why nobody seems to ask, where does the president get all this power that he can put on a tariff and do all this mischief? So it's all this economic planning and too much power in the hands of a president. But then again, if you defer and take it away from it, it goes to the World Trade Organization.
Right,
then
we don't want that. We don't want the bureaucrats
too.
overseas. Bureaucrats here are bad enough. Actually, the Constitution does give the power of tariffs to Congress, but that was amended over the years, decades ago, so they'd have to go back and change some of the rules. Let me just ask you, though, about jobs, because the president is very clear in his own words. He says it's about jobs, and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin was trying to make the same case to a skeptical Maria Bartiromo on FBN earlier today. Let's just play the tape.
Do you worry that while you're trying to protect the hundreds of thousands of jobs in the steel industry, you're threatening millions of jobs in other industries?
The president is very focused on jobs. As you know, it's his #1 priority. The president is not going to do anything that creates job loss in these other areas. Again, we have a thought-out process.
Dr. Paul, you have 140,000 jobs in the steel industry that's being protected by these tariffs, and you have about 6.5 million jobs in companies, manufacturing jobs, that use steel that might be hurt. Do you think in the end, jobs will be helped or hurt by the tariffs?
Well, I think they'll be hurt, and those numbers never pan out. And besides, if you take them from one, you might lose them to somebody else. You know, so I think there is always a cost. And most economists have over the years indicated that tariffs aren't good for the economy, and it doesn't really create jobs. It may create or preserve a job in a certain industry that's having trouble. But if there's trouble in an industry, I remember when we worried about this back in the 70s, our automobiles weren't as good as the Japanese, and we had to protect them. Well, you don't want to protect something that's not efficient, or if we have too many regulations, or if it's due to the monetary policy. So you don't want to protect that, and then you protect the mistakes. And that's why bailouts are bad. It's a form of a bailout, and a lot of people talked about that during the recession. Why bail out the people who have been making all the mistakes? But essentially that's what we did.
All right, let me go to the source. The president himself tweeted out earlier, from Bush 1 to present, our country has lost more than 55,000 factories, 6 million manufacturing jobs, and accumulated trade deficits of more than $12 trillion. Last year, we had a trade deficit of almost $800 billion. Bad policies and leadership. We must win again. We should remind folks that one of the worst trade deficit years we've had in decades was back in 1984. In that year, when we had such a bad trade deficit, the economy actually grew 7.3%. So it's not clear that there's a direct relationship between trade deficits and growth.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about trade deficits, because what you look at to find out what happened, there's always a balance of trade. Now, when we have a monetary system like what we have now, and we get to print the money, you're going to have a trade deficit by its very nature, because we have the cash and we buy stuff and we get a good price on it. But it's not static. It isn't like we lost on that. The Chinese and others do us a big favor. They buy up our debt. So we literally export some of our penalties and export the inflation, and it's not quite like the trade deficit. I think what you have to look at is the total picture of the balance of trade and where it's going, and what happens when you have a central bank manipulating interest rates and currency, which encourages debt. So if you patch up some of these things, it doesn't deal with the big problem, and that is debt.
You know what I would love to have, Dr. Paul? I'd love to have another 5 minutes to talk to you, but I'd love to have you and Wilbur Ross in a debate. That would be a thing of beauty. I would love. Someday we'll get that done, all right?
There you go.
Dr. Paul, good to see you. Dr. Ron Paul.
Nice
Appreciate it.
Nice to see you.